Good morning, everybody. So I'm here today to talk about where I'm at with my research. I'm here to give a glimpse of the literature review and to talk about the role of brand communities in value co-creation, the role of brand communities in innovation. To some, the role of brand communities and what brand communities are might seem fairly obvious. To others, it might be a little bit more mysterious. Brand communities are something that has existed for a very long time. However, research in this area has really developed and mushroomed with the turn of the 21st century, with the advent of Web 2.0 technologies, the development of social media, social networking platforms. And so understanding how these communities could be leveraged in the process of value co-creation and in the process of innovation as a whole is quite important these days. So just a general overview of what I'll be talking about. Again, what is value co-creation? Some of the theoretical underpinnings, some of the definitions in the literature to really grasp the concept, because these days we have the concept of co-consuming communities, consuming communities, brand communities. Some of them seem to mean the same thing. However, in reality, some conceptual delineations exist. So in looking at value co-creation, simply put, a form of market or business strategy that emphasizes the generation and ongoing realization of mutual firm customer value. It's essentially a way of reconceptualizing the generation and creation of value away from a firm-centric or a firm position, blurring the boundaries between the firm and the customers to a point where customers, consumers, and stakeholders play a role in creating value. It's also interesting to stop here and think about what value is. Value itself has been reconceptualized to a certain extent. So what is value? What is of value to me? Who determines the value of a product? This whole notion of value has changed, and has changed with the development of the service dominant logic, which has come to replace the goods dominant logic. Hand in hand with the service dominant logic, we have the consumer culture theory developed around the 1980s, and self-identity theory, which my colleague alluded to earlier, which can be bifurcated into self-concept, social identity, and personal identity. So in looking at the service dominant logic, it's essentially a new way of thinking, a dominant logic that has developed, again, with the turn of the 21st century, around 2004, by Vargo and Lush as being the authoritative figures in this area. It's continuously being refined. It's essentially a set of axioms and foundational premises that have reconceptualized value, have looked at how value is created. So this is where the link with value co-creation comes in. Looking at value as being generated by a network or constellation of actors. So once again, not within the firm, but throughout a network. Initially, this was looked at in the form of dyads of customer firm, customer, supplier firm. These days, this has evolved into, from a dyad perspective into a network perspective, and more recently into a systems perspective. So it's the whole constellation of actors that are seen as resource integrators that bring together these different resources to generate value and create value in a continuous and dynamic process. So value is seen as being dynamic, value is seen as being multidimensional, value, most importantly, is seen as being unique and phenomenological to the consumer. I might see something as valuable for certain reasons, which might have something to do with my social identity, my personal identity. Others, depending on their context, will see something as valuable for other reasons. And so looking at value in exchange evolving into value in use, more recently evolving into value in context. Value is completely contextual and depends on the person, depends on the individual. And it's dynamic, it's changing the whole time. It's essentially a dialogue between the consumers, all actors as resource integrators with the firm. So how can we leverage or benefit from these situations? How can we create conducive conditions for the co-creation of value? Looking at the consumer culture theory, it's essentially a way of looking at the market with a postmodern perspective. So looking at the market as an amalgamation of fragmented cultural objects, social resources, and within this context and in relation to social identity theory, consumers are seen as continuously working towards building their self-identity, building their own personal identity, building them through a combination of different cultural objects, artifacts, which might be represented by different brands and commercial objects. And so they use this in the construction of their own identity in a continuous process. Community was seen as being something rural. Community was seen as representing different values, social values that were traditional, as opposed to the postmodern era in which society is seen as being perhaps fragmented, suffering from a loss of values. And so the concept of brand community has come back into the fore, being discussed. It brings consumers together in the 21st century. Most of the research in this area has been done in relation to social networking platforms. And so looking at just some of the definitions in relation to brand community, what are the hallmarks and the features of a brand community? A consciousness of a kind. So knowing that you belong to a community, knowing who this community is, rituals and traditions. How do you develop rituals and traditions? Based on the history, based on practice, based on norms that are established and expected, holding different community members to these norms. And finally, a sense of obligation, moral obligation to the community. And so different definitions have developed. However, these hallmarks are very much agreed upon. Community can be divided as well into brand communities. Some have looked at brand communities as being of different types: innovative brand communities, normal brand communities. However, most of the literature just addresses brand communities in relation to social networking sites. in terms of these three hallmarks, in terms of being a group that is not necessarily geographically bound, a group that is online. Of course, there are other groups that are offline as well, but in this context, online. And how, once again, to look at the conditions that would be conducive to the creation of value. So if we look at one of the more recent definitions, a virtual social network brand community is specialized, geographically dispersed, based on a structured and dynamic network of relationships among participants sharing a common focus. Looking at some of the different gaps in the literature and how the gap has evolved, it seems up to now, an article in 2008, it seems up to now that the potential of brand communities has been underestimated in marketing practices. Jumping a little forward, there are few interpretive studies on the mechanism of UI, user innovation. Jumping to Parmentier, additional research should spread to other industrial sectors and study the differences between digital products and physical products, innovative brand communities, especially with regard to organizational features. And then more recently, some interesting statements taken from these articles. To date, there has been no single study that has developed a comprehensive examination of the key drivers, outcomes, and moderators of CBE. CBE is consumer brand engagement. And so when we talk about value co-creation and how to address value co-creation, engagement is a critical factor that has been looked at, especially in the case of brand communities, how to engage customers and what does engagement mean and how to break down engagement into different processes or precursors such as involvement, participation, how this relates to identification, and then these drivers or antecedents, how they relate to the construct of consumer brand engagement with certain outcomes. These outcomes normally include referrals, attitude, brand loyalty, which might be divided into attitude and loyalty and different kinds of loyalty, satisfaction, etc. However, one critical and missing element is value co-creation, is the creation of value. And so CBE as a construct, which is one of the central constructs that I'm looking at, is not an end all. It's a means towards an end, looking at engagement and how engagement with these brand communities and different customers can lead to value co-creation. So just to wrap it up, coming back to value co-creation should be characterized through the roles of the customer and the firm and recognition of the value spheres that include the firm and the customer. Nevertheless, value co-creation still remains an elusive concept. And one of the most recent studies that I've been looking at, an article in 2018, talks about looking at value co-creation as a possible outcome of CBE, consumer brand engagement. And my research objectives in this context, to explore the role of value co-creation as related to consumer brand engagement, to identify the mechanisms and factors enabling brand communities to participate in value co-creation, and to develop a conceptual framework for the operationalization of CBE in value co-creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ammar.